I would like to point out that the quarantine bill we are presenting today is respectful of the fundamental rights and freedoms guaranteed by the Constitution and is also in line with international health regulations of 2005. I shall now go through the salient features of the quarantine bill. Clause 2 of the bill defines the term communicable disease, and a list of such diseases is provided in the schedule. It is to be noted that in the existing Act and regulations, the definition of quarantinable disease was limited to plague, cholera, and yellow fever. Clause 2 further provides that the quarantine authority shall be the Director General Health Services. The quarantine authority will have the power to, inter alia, designate premises to be used as quarantine facilities and to designate quarantine officers to control such facilities. There is no explicit provision in the existing legislation for the designation of quarantine facilities. The bill provides in a clear manner the designation, staffing, use, and management of the quarantine facility. Clause 3 empowers the Prime Minister to make, during a quarantine period, an order to A. prohibit the entry of aircraft and ships into Mauritius, B. order that all persons shall remain indoors, and C. order that commercial premises or offices shall remain closed for such period and under such terms and conditions as he may specify. Clause 3 also provides for the Commissioner of Police to issue a permit to allow a person to be outdoors for such purpose and under such terms and conditions as he may specify. No such provision exists under the Quarantine Act of 1954. Mr. Speaker, sir, the bill is introducing a new concept of quarantine period. As a matter of fact, where the Minister of Health considers that a communicable disease may outbreak or spread in Mauritius, Clause 4 is empowering him to declare that A. there is or is likely to be an epidemic of the disease, and B. a quarantine period will be in force. It is to be noted that the Prime Minister can issue an order under Clause 3 only after a quarantine period has come into force. Clause 5 provides that the quarantine authority, that is, the Director General of Health Services, may designate such premises as he considers appropriate to be a quarantine facility. Clause 5 further provides that the quarantine authority may use and occupy private premises as quarantine facility after reaching an agreement with the owner and occupier on such terms and conditions as the Minister may approve. Such agreement shall, for obvious reason, be exempted from the provisions of the Public Procurement Act. Moreover, any such quarantine facility must be under the control of the quarantine officer. Clause 6 provides for the quarantine authority to designate a medical practitioner as quarantine officer. Clause 7 defines the category of persons who may be confined in a quarantine facility, namely A. any person who travels into Mauritius from abroad, B. any person who has been or may have been in contact with a person who has or may have a communicable disease, or C. any person who has otherwise been exposed to a communicable disease. It is noteworthy that a person may be quarantined only during a quarantine period. Mr. Speaker, sir, Clause 7 also provides for a quarantine person to be issued with a certificate of quarantine and for the person to undergo such medical examination as the quarantine officer may deem necessary. provisions have also been made for a quarantined person in need of medical treatment to be examined by a specialist and for him to be transferred to a hospital for treatment or in a private health institution upon his request and at his own cost. However, such private health institutions should have been designated as a quarantine facility under this Act and have adequate facilities for treating the disease. Furthermore, Clause 7 provides for the conditions for discharge of a quarantined person and the conditions for the readmission of a discharged person into a quarantine facility. In fact, if a person who has been discharged from a quarantine facility fails to comply with the conditions imposed or causes a risk of harm to the public health, the quarantine authority may at any time order that the person be readmitted into a quarantine facility. Clause 8 provides that no person shall enter or leave a quarantine facility without the authorization of a quarantine officer. Clause 9 imposes a duty on every person to provide to a quarantine officer such information as the latter may reasonably require to enable him to ascertain, inter alia, if the person presents any symptoms of any communicable disease. Failure to comply with such a request or providing false or misleading information constitutes an offense. Clause 10 imposes a duty on any person who suspects that he is or may be afflicted with a communicable disease or has been in contact with a person who has a communicable disease to disclose the information forthwith to a quarantine officer, and failure to comply with this provision will constitute an offense. Clause 11 defines the powers of the police in relation to the enforcement of a Quarantine Act. It provides that a police officer shall extend such assistance as may be required by a quarantine officer in the discharge of his duties. The police officer may also A. board a ship or an aircraft, B. enter premises without a warrant, and C. arrest without a warrant a person whom he has reasonable cause to believe has committed an offence under the Act or any regulations made under the Act. Clause 12 makes provision for the offences and penalties. This clause provides that any person who A. refuses to answer or knowingly gives a misleading answer to an inquiry made under the authority of this Act, B. intentionally withholds any information reasonably required of him by a person acting under the authority of this Act, C. knowingly furnishes to a person any information which he knows to be false, D. refuses or willfully omits to do an act which is required to do by this Act, E. refuses or willfully omits to carry out a lawful order, instruction or condition made, given or imposed by a person acting under the authority of this Act, F. assaults, resists, insults, willfully obstructs or intimidates a person acting under the authority of this Act, G. whilst being in a quarantine facility damages any property therein, or H. otherwise contravenes the Act or any regulations, order, or notice under the Act, shall commit an offence and shall on conviction be liable to a fine not exceeding 500,000 rupees and to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 5 years.